we're going to change directions a little bit and talk about physical restraints. And I have to say that I have significant misgivings about even getting into this subject area, mostly because I know so many of the people taking this course are lay people or individuals who are working by themselves. And so for those people, I have to tell you that I can probably sum up this section into one word: don't. When it comes to the idea of putting a restraint on somebody during crisis, it is almost always considerably better to not do it, even if a person might get harmed or even if there might be significant damage to valuable property, than it would be for us to intervene. In fact, we live by a simple rule. The only time we apply a restraint to somebody is if we are certain that it is a more safe option than not applying that restraint. And we have to also remember that our own safety is our first priority. In fact, our second priority is other people, such as bystanders or other people in the family home or in the community facility. It's not till we get to the third priority that we start to think about the individual. Now, as a professional, often it's possible to address all three of those priorities. But as a family member or as an individual working on your own, even if you are in a professional capacity, it might not be possible to protect all three of those different priorities. It might come down to simply isolating the individual and providing for the safety of yourself and others who are innocent bystanders. Now, the truth is there are occasions when restraints become necessary, and that's why I'm dealing with this subject. The other reason is because I'm so often asked about it, and if people are going to do it, I'd rather they do it understanding some basic principles than doing it the wrong way and making it far more likely that they and the consumers are going to get injured. So the very first principle we want people to understand is that restraint is always a last resort. It is almost always better to use barriers and escape routes, isolating the person so that they calm down more quickly. If you engage an individual in a restraint and you are not successful, then you will have the effect of stimulating them to even higher levels of aggressive behavior. So it's often better to simply make sure that you have something in between you and that individual that makes it easier for you to escape, something like furniture or a table or a natural barrier, and that you want to keep yourself close to a door so that you can leave if that needs to happen. If you're in something like a moving vehicle, it's important that you think about getting off the road and parking your vehicle so that you can get out of that car quickly if necessary. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, I have literally stood outside my vehicle while an individual was becoming aggressive and tearing my car apart while I looked through the window. As much as that might be a difficult thing to do, I found myself grateful that it was my car and not me that was being the subject of that aggression. If we do have to restrain people, it should always be a very brief process, just long enough to allow us to leave or others to leave. For example, I have restrained people in order to redirect them into a room and have everybody else leave that room. Or I've restrained that person long enough to take them and move them out of the room and then lock everybody that wanted to be safe from that person into the room. And you'll notice that I didn't say I moved the individual into a room and locked them in. That would be unethical and in most cases would be illegal because now I am containing a person against their will. But the people who are potential victims of that aggressive individual, they are people who are allowed to go and lock themselves into a secure area, an area of refuge. And in fact, when we put locks on the doors of our facilities, they weren't locks to lock people in that were being aggressive, but instead to keep people out if they were being aggressive. We follow a principle called the principle of least intrusion if we have to use a restraint. And what this means is that we employ the fewest points of contact possible, avoiding joints for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why we avoid joints is because joints are easily used by the subject of the restraint to twist and manipulate your hands so that they can work their way out of restraints. The other reason is that you're more likely to cause soft tissue damage if you are intentionally pressurizing against a joint. One of the things we want to remember is we use the least pressure possible. Restraints are strictly about keeping an individual from harming you or others, and we don't need to cause pain or potential injury in order to make that happen. If we do have to put a restraint on somebody, we're going to act with extreme discipline. In other words, we're going to make sure that we do not allow that person to struggle. If we invite any type of struggle, what we're saying to that person is that combating us is going to potentially be successful, and we will see the person actually trying to aggress. You may be surprised, but when effectively applied, restraints actually sometimes cause people to stop fighting. They realize after the first few seconds that it's fruitless, they naturally decide to contain their energy, and that starts them on the calming process. We never ever use strikes as a way of restraining somebody. In my career, having dealt with many, many aggressive people over the years, I have never had an occasion where I needed to strike other people. I have had to block strikes from other people, but I've never needed to strike somebody on my own. Neither have we ever used restraint as a way to teach somebody, to punish somebody, or to control their behavior. It was only ever done when it was the last resort, as said, when the other person had been an aggressor first and there was no other way to deal with this. I want to take a moment and mention as a sidebar, especially under the subject of controlling behavior. We never use restraint to move people just because they are being non-compliant, defiant, impassive, or any word that describes a person who doesn't cooperate. It is never acceptable, with the possible exception of a person who is, for example, deciding to throw themselves down in the middle of a busy street or on railroad tracks. Then I can see us needing to move that person out of harm's way with physical restraint. However, normally when I see people doing this, it is in an act of innocent and understandable frustration, but I think that sometimes people are losing their perspective. For example, here are a couple of circumstances where I've witnessed it. An individual who did not want to get out of a car on a hot day. The staff person was concerned about the individual's health and welfare, which was very admirable, but the way they pursued that issue wasn't very astute. Because the individual was refusing to get out of the car, the staff person should probably have turned the car around and gone back to the individual's home. But instead, the staff person began wrestling with this person, trying to get them out of the car, which endangered both the staff and the client. And in the end, wasn't successful. In fact, it seemed to make the client more certain that they were not going to move. Another scenario where I've seen this done is in kindergarten classes and grade 1 classes, where children crawl underneath tables. And because there's such a difference in the size of the staff person and then the child, it seems like it's a fairly easy thing to do to move that child. After all, we are not likely to cause them harm in that circumstance because we're not straining ourselves. Or are we? Ask any person who works for WorkSafe BC what sorts of injuries cause people to hurt their backs. It's not when they go and lift something that's really heavy. It's when they lift something and they're unprepared for an awkward movement. And certainly lifting a squirming child is a perfect example of this. It's an invitation to be hurt. And your claim can be denied by WorkSafe if your employer says that it's not a regular part of your job. And it certainly is not a regular part of our job to lift and move children who are being non-compliant. In fact, in point of fact, it is actually something that is reportable to the Ministry for Children and Families. In other words, it could be considered suspected abuse to start laying our hands on children and moving them about physically when there's really no reason for us to do so. A third example that I've seen was an individual who did not want to leave a building. I've actually seen this in more than one circumstance where a person didn't want to leave a mall or a store or a school. And staff people, often because they were being pressured by security or by other patrons of that store or other building, have decided that it was time to move that person. Instead, they need to make sure that they're approaching things from a situational control approach. In other words, dealing with that security staff, dealing with those bystanders, and giving the individual time to digest and come to the realization that they need to move on their own. Every time we would approach that individual and try to engage them, we actually ended up making them often more entrenched in their behavior. And the best thing we could do is use what we call an extinction of attention strategy, removing attention for that person, making it as concrete as possible for them that staying in the building wasn't going to get them what they wanted. And as strange as it might seem, the best thing we could do sometimes was to move away from the person. And while we could still see them peripherally or even see them frontally from the distance, to the individual, it was apparent that we were not interacting with them. And most of the time, after a while, the person sort of gave up and moved on their own. Now, if a security person or police officers need to move an individual under that circumstance, that's different. It's in the realm of their skills or their powers to do so. However, it's not in our power to do so, and if we're going to try and maintain a therapeutic or a personal relationship with that person, it's going to be very difficult to do that once physical interactions have become a part of that relationship. Remember one more thing. If you are using your physical ability to move that individual, then you are communicating to them that they're allowed to do that back, that they're allowed to do that to people who are smaller than them or to you when you're in a vulnerable position. So we want to make sure we don't send that message. It's also important, if we're going to have to apply restraint, to have helpers and witnesses. In fact, over the years, as I've developed crisis intervention plans for various organizations and homes and facilities, I have, in some cases, had to put in place a protocol that stated that no restraint was to be used on an individual until there was at least one helper present. Normally that was because the individual was either very large and strong or because they were adept at aggression. Over the years, most of the people that I've worked with were not terribly adept at acting out violently. They did so with a rashness. They often did so briefly. They were sometimes quite strong because they were adrenalized, but they weren't necessarily skilled at violence. When that individual is somewhat skilled at being violent, they are able to target an individual skillfully, or when they're particularly strong, there may be times when you literally need to let that person potentially harm themselves until somebody else can come along and help you. The other idea is to have those witnesses present. Those witnesses play a number of roles. One of them is that later on, if people allege that you did something that was untoward, the witnesses are there as an objective observer to say what actually happened. But the witnesses also play a vital role in making sure that anything you cannot see is made apparent to you. For example, I've worked in circumstances where individuals were very good at picking up objects and using them as weapons. And we couldn't always see that because we might have been restraining the person from the front, I should say, while they used their hands behind themselves to grab an object and use it potentially as a weapon. Or sometimes you're restraining a person and you can't tell what they're about to do with their teeth or their fingernails. And again, a witness can help us with that. Witnesses also have another role, and that is that they can go and engage further help. Security guards, police, other staff people. They can also do crowd management or get other bystanders, other clients and consumers out of the way. They can document what's happening. They can help you monitor time. They can help you monitor the possessions of the individual. For example, in one circumstance where we had to restrain a person, the individual was very concerned about their glasses, which had fallen off, and the staff person that was serving as a witness was able to pick them up and just show the client that the glasses were safely in their possession. And that helped to calm the person down. So think about all of those as reasons why we might want to have witnesses and helpers present. Now, when we have a helper present, it's very important, as we talked about previously, for us to understand who's the leader and who's the follower or followers. There are times when I have used restraint protocols that truly utilize 2 or 3 people, and if you have 2 or 3 people trying to take the lead, you are going to be in trouble. We have to have a very concrete approach to communicating through a restraint. The leader has to make sure that they have told that colleague exactly what they want and make sure that the colleague understands what is being asked for before, for example, they change a grip, or before a person lets go of another person to open up a door, or before we release a hold. So we're extremely precise in the communication we do under these circumstances. And I like to tell a little story here, and this is a true story about a circumstance I was in where an individual was being quite aggressive. And this individual was one of the more uniquely skilled and dangerous aggressors that I worked with over my career. He was about 240 pounds and about 6 foot 3 inches tall. And luckily for us, his behaviors as he reached his third phase, his crisis phase, were quite apparent. In fact, what he did that was very unique was that he indicated to everybody that he was about to go into stage 3 by literally yelling out the same 2-word phrase every time. He would yell, "Call police!" very loudly, which was, if you think about it, very considerate of him, because we actually needed to call the police at that exact moment. So this particular day, the individual had been escalating. He was on the way home, and we weren't sure if he was going to leave or whether or not he was going to escalate further. And unfortunately, he decided at the last moment that he was going to escalate. At this point, I was in the bathroom with only one exit door, and I happened to be holding a pen in my hand. The individual came to the door and walked up to me and began to tap me in the chest silently, which was an unusual but recognized behavior from this individual. So knowing that he was escalating, I reduced my ability to be considered a threat. For example, I put the pen down to make sure it wasn't used as a weapon by myself or him. I used a calm and collected voice to let others know that I was going to need some help. And I did my best to try and position myself towards the escape route, which was the door of the bathroom. But I wasn't successful in that. Within the first few seconds, he yelled, "Call police," and wrapped me in a bear hug and tried to wrestle me to the ground. I informed my coworkers, who were already en route, to call the police, and I called a code word, which in our agency was the word party, and that meant we needed help. So a colleague came and helped me. I used a restraint. I used a release to get out of the hold, and this release allowed me to get out, and then myself and the colleague, who we'll call Michael, were able to put this person into a team restraint. The two of us were holding his arms, and we had him bent over a sink vanity while we waited for the police. And he outweighed probably both of us added together, and so we were concerned about our ability to continue to hold him. Now, the interesting thing about this individual, who we'll call Jordan, was that his mother was present at the time that this had happened. In fact, his mother had been part of what was escalating him in this particular day. She had started to talk to him about a court date, and that had had an effect on him of aggravating him. His mother came down and observed Jordan being restrained, and she did not possess a strong grasp of English, and she began to talk about his teeth and saying that his teeth hurt. It wasn't immediately clear to us whether or not she was indicating that she felt Jordan's agitation had been caused by tooth pain, or whether or not Jordan was being forced, the way we were holding Jordan might have been causing tooth pain. I was concerned, based on what she was saying, that perhaps as Jordan was being restrained against this sink vanity, perhaps his head was rubbing against the taps or something else. And so I turned to my coworker, Michael, who was helping to restrain, and we're holding from behind. And I asked him, "Michael, can you see if Jordan is, if his face is in the taps?" Well, Michael was not really as practiced as he should have been in terms of the communication we used in the circumstance, because I didn't ask him to let go of Jordan. I only asked him if he was able to see from where he was. But Michael read into what I had said and let Jordan go so that he could look at his face. And that was a very significant issue. At that moment, Jordan, upon feeling the release of this hold, began to buck very much like a bucking bronco. And he was a very strong individual, and he managed to kick me, kicking backwards. He kicked through my legs. Luckily for me, he kicked backwards and up, really sort of kicking me in the rear end. And I loudly and clearly told Michael that I expected him to grab the individual again and apply the restraint again. But it was quite a struggle, and we were very lucky to get out of it without either being harmed or without having to do harm to Jordan. This individual was such a challenge to restrain that ultimately, when the local police department came, it took 4 police officers to restrain him, and he needed to be restrained using passive restraints on both his hands and his ankles. The point of the story is that Jordan was calming down somewhat in the moments before Michael let go of him. Had Michael continued to hold that restraint and simply listened carefully to the communication, we would have probably seen that individual de-escalate significantly, and in the 8 to 10 minutes it took for the police to arrive, he might not have needed to be restrained by them, and probably would not have involved the level of restraint that ultimately happened. So this communication cannot be overstressed. When we are communicating to each other, we have to be very precise, and we have to make sure we understand what the other person is saying before we do it. Couple of things we want to avoid. We want to avoid exposing our back to an individual, because if you think about it, there's very little you can do to defend yourself from the back. Your limbs don't go that way, and of course you can't see. When a person attacks us from the back, it's very likely that we're going to fall. And when we fall, we have to remember that any blow to our head while we are laying on the ground is the equivalent of 2 blows. One as we're hit on the side of the head by the person with the object or with their fist, and on the opposite side of our head by the ground. And this is where we're much more likely to sustain serious damage. So as we leave an individual, we want to leave sidestepping or backstepping. Generally sidestepping is preferable so we don't trip, but backstepping may be the only way. We also want to avoid doing any kind of hold on an individual that would involve possible asphyxiation. And this means nothing that will endanger a person's diaphragm. So some of you may be familiar with a hold that was called the basket hold. And the basket hold is very outmoded. It never was very effective in the first place, but what it looks like is that a person is held by their wrists and their arms are wrapped around their body at or near their stomach. This is a problem for two reasons. First of all, it doesn't avoid joints, which we talked about here. The person's wrists will invariably become sweaty and slippery, and they will be able to simply pull themselves free. And in order to combat against that, people often push or pull harder on those wrists, which causes the potential for dislocation, or much more seriously, for that asphyxiation of the person. Another thing that we see is people being bent over objects at waist height. And this is a very dangerous thing to do because the person may be, particularly, for example, in things like sofas, beds, and so forth, the person is now going to have an object pushing directly into their diaphragm. And then the third thing is something that, believe it or not, used to be called the John Brown therapeutic hold. And I'm not quite sure how it got that name, but it is certainly not therapeutic. And what it is basically putting a person face down on the ground, holding their arms behind their back, and having an individual sit across their back. And that as well is to be avoided. And it's also to be avoided sitting on their front, but that probably goes without saying. So we really want to avoid holding across a person's chest or arms. What we normally do, chest or torso, what we normally do is hold the upper biceps of a person if we have to do a restraint. I am not going to demonstrate that to you in the video because I feel it would be unethical of me to prescribe an approach that is that generic for people. It is very important, if you're working with an individual who has incidents of aggression, to have a behavioral consultant come in and give you some guidance around developing a specific protocol for that individual. I will demonstrate a few basic ideas in terms of releases and so forth, but I will not be demonstrating specifically how to hold an individual in a separate video. For those of you who are interested in getting further training on this, I would highly recommend that you go out and find MANT training, M-A-N-D-T, or Nonviolent Crisis Intervention Training, also known as CPI, or Crisis Prevention Institute. And you can get that training and be trained as an employer where you work readily by looking at both of their websites. And those are both considered to be industry standards in training. They're not inexpensive, but the good thing about it is that you can go off and use that same training within your agency once you've been trained. And so only one person needs to pay for the training. Thereafter, everybody else that is in that agency can be trained by the person who went to the original course. Do not attempt to disarm an individual. That is something we see in the movies. We are not going to do our best imitations of Steven Seagal. If a person is holding any type of an object that they might potentially use as a weapon against you, it's important that you take it seriously. It doesn't have to be something that is designed to be a weapon. And some of the individuals I've worked with over the years were very adept at turning things into weapons. In one case, we worked with a gentleman who learned how to use tableware, including spoons and forks, so those were removed. Next thing we found him using were pencils and pens. Those were subsequently removed. And then he began going out in the backyard and finding sticks. And it became apparent to us that really there was almost no way for us to control an individual's ability to create or find something that could be used as a weapon. We really need to make sure that we simply stay out of the reach of a weapon if a person has one. And that is where we're going to call 911 and get extra help. So I don't want to harp on the concept that I started with, but in this particular instance it bears repeating that I have given this information somewhat hesitatingly. It's very important for us to understand that there is a limited amount we can do when an individual is being physically aggressive. And I have to tell you that it is as much about a person's competence and confidence in terms of dealing with aggressive individuals as it is to do with strength and size. The two most violent people, the most dangerous people I've worked with in my career were very small, They were easily underestimated by the staff people. One was a woman, shorter than 5 feet tall, who walked with a very significant and pronounced limp due to cerebral palsy. But that woman, because people took her for granted, because people approached her when she was becoming aggressive, when they might otherwise have avoided person doing that same type of behavior, she was able to cause quite a lot of harm to others. The other was a young man who was literally about 4.5 feet tall, and he was a person who engaged in a lot of stereotypic behavior, a lot of hand waving and rocking and kicking of his feet back and forth while he sat on a chair. And what we came to realize was all of that movement constituted very significant exercise. His limbs became very, very strong. And he would approach people sometimes without any outward sign that he was feeling angry. And he would go up under the guise of making it look like he was going to tousle somebody's hair or horse around with them. And he would grab somebody's hair and begin to shake their head back and forth. Now, that person was very dangerous only because individuals didn't learn to be more cautious. And what we simply learned to do when that gentleman walked up towards us with that same type of approach was stand up so that he couldn't grab our hair. And we redirected his behavior so that we could make sure it really was playful. We did things like high fives or funny handshakes with him, or shook his hand so that he could use his hand in a positive way instead of causing harm to other people. And when it was evident that this man became agitated, we really directed our attention to keeping others away from him instead of having people walk towards him thinking he was harmless. So please make sure that you think about literally everything you can do before applying restraints. It may come down to letting a person damage valuable property, including things like cars and furniture, in order to make sure that you remain safe. We must always remember that we have absolutely no chance of helping an individual if we do not maintain a trusting relationship, whether it's a personal relationship or a professional one. And as an underpinning to that relationship, we must have dignity. I don't think it takes a great deal of imagination to consider what happens to the way you feel about an individual if they have applied a physical restraint to you. It would feel humiliating. It would feel as though we were no longer equal. And so it is a very significant decision in the interaction between a therapeutic person and a person receiving support for us to apply a restraint. It isn't irreversible. It isn't something that can't be managed later on, but it is difficult to manage. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that the relationship I've had with an individual after I've applied a restraint was very different in most cases than the one I had before I had to do that. And while it might have seemed completely obvious and logical to me that the person's aggression was the very reason why I had to apply that restraint, and therefore they were the ones who were sort of making the decision, it wasn't apparent to them in any of the cases I ever had to deal with. Not a single one did a person afterwards say, I understand why you did that. I really didn't put you in a good position. Now, I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm just saying it doesn't happen as a general rule. So it is something we need to keep in mind as well. It can be more difficult tomorrow to go back to doing this job if we have had to do a physical intervention for an individual.